I've been writing poetry or verse since I was 8 years old, but it was more than 15 years before I felt ready to bring out my first book. And it was called NIRVANA at 10 rupees. It was published by Adil Jasawala for a small publishing house called Zal Praxis. The thing with poetry is that the big publishers will tell you that poetry doesn't sell, so poets are always depending on each other to bring out their work and support each other's writing. So Zal Praxis was a very small endeavor that brought out 4 or 5 books at that time. This was in 1990. And as a lot of small publishing houses do, it shut down a few years later. But I was fortunate that this book did receive some amount of attention. And even though distribution was always a problem, it did get some kind of notice, and I think that made a huge difference to the way my writing developed. And I owe this entirely to Adil Jasawala, who's a very senior poet and who was the publisher of this book. And it's been 12 years now since my second book was out. The second book was called Stet. It was brought out in 2000 or 2012, in 2002, I forget now the exact year. But again, with poetry, it did not receive any distribution. It was not, the quality of production was not what I was hoping for. Now that has been brought out again in a new edition under the imprint of Sparrow, which is a women's archival publishing house. And Sparrow is sound and picture research archives for women. It is not available in the bookstores because distribution is still a problem, but I'm hoping that, some people will see it and read it. I did put in a few of the poems from the first book because that first book has been out of print for a very long time. See, one doesn't choose themes consciously. It's just that, after you've developed a body of work that you realize that there are some common threads. And I realized that a lot of my poetry is about women's issues, and what it takes to survive as a woman. And I think a lot of this came also from my early days as a journalist, where I was writing about women's issues a great deal. For 4 years, I was the editor of the women's section of a newspaper. This was in the mid-80s. And my editor wanted fashion, cookery, because that's what women are supposed to be reading, right? And I refused to do that because the women's movement was at its peak. There were a lot of issues that needed to be talked about: dowry deaths, wife beating, domestic violence. There were a lot of things that had to be, put out there. And I had the space to do it. I had the newsprint to do it, and I felt that needed to be done. And I think some of that found its way indirectly into my poetry. I do not write specifically about an incident. But what happens is, I think there's a process of osmosis that takes place, and somewhere it comes together in ways that I don't recognize or understand when it's actually happening. It'll just come together in in an image that when I look back and say, okay, I don't know where that came from. Similarly, there was a poem that used the image of brown sugar addiction. Now, I used to counsel brown sugar addicts. What happened was, I wrote an article about brown sugar. I wrote a series, and I couldn't just leave it at that. I got close to the brown sugar addicts, and many of them talked to me about their problems. And then I found myself writing a poem that became the title poem of my first book, where I do have that phrase, NIRVANA at 10 rupees, which, it's not directly about addiction. It's about, love. It's about a relationship. But it uses that central image to make the point. So these are things that don't happen consciously, and it's always been that way with me. There are times when I find something in my handwriting that I have no recollection of. I don't know when I wrote it. There are poems that I've written at 3 in the morning that are literally nightmare poems. In fact, one of them became recognized as the poem that people associated my work with the first book. It's called Why Rabbits Never Sleep. Okay, for me, the poetry happened before the journalism. In fact, I was about 6 or 7 when I first started writing bits of verse. I would not call them poetry because, okay, they had rhyme, they had rhythm, they had meter. You know, you grew up on nursery rhymes, you grew up with maybe Wordsworth, you know. So I was writing much earlier. Some of it was published when I was 10. So I had my first taste of blood when I was very young. And because I was writing and publishing at that age, and because it had to do with words, I felt that journalism would be the right career for me, which took me a very long time to realize that journalism and poetry are actually very different from each other, because journalism is all about headlines, deadlines, getting it out there on time, talking to other people, getting out of yourself and making, contact with other people. Whereas poetry is a far more inward movement. It's something that takes a very long time to happen. I grew up sort of learning that, journalism consists of words that come very quickly, disappear equally quickly, and beyond a point you don't trust it. At least I personally did not trust it too much. Whereas with poetry, it's a very, very slow process, which is why I took 10 years with my first book. I was very close to Nissim Ezekiel at one point in my early stage, when I was 16, 17. I met him when I was 16, and he kept asking me, don't you want to bring out a book? And I said, no, I'm not ready. The poems are not mature enough. They're not good enough. I don't want to just bring out a book to tell everyone that I've brought out a book. Because once that book is out there, it is separate from you. It has its own life. It has nothing to do with you beyond a point, and I just felt that I needed to take my time with it, and I'm perfectly happy to do that because I want to be very careful and not make any mistakes with my third book, which I'm hoping will happen in 2013, if I can find a publisher. If I can find a publisher who says, okay, who does not say that poetry doesn't sell, so we don't publish, we're not going to publish your work because you can't make money out of poetry. And I'm just hoping that will happen, but it's been 12 years since that book. So I'm beginning to think an average of 12 years is where I am in a comfortable space. It's difficult for me to talk about my own poetry, but critics have talked about imagery as being a very strong part of it. And like I said, I don't talk about specific incidents. I can't do that. I sometimes look at poets who will, be at an event and write about it. And I don't know how that happens for them, because for me it's a far more, it's a far longer, more detailed process of osmosis, as I said. And I don't think I write specific poetry. I would not write about a woman being beaten up, but the image of a woman being beaten up will be there in the work. I've also been told that a lot of the poetry is extremely violent, and people have asked me, where does that violence come from? Because, looking at you, you seem so calm and peaceful, and where is all that blood, and, where is it from? And I think it goes back to that time where I wrote about women's issues and, assimilated a great deal of that. And, I think lately, my poetry has been far more, what shall I say, it's calmer, it's quieter, but I think there's still an undercurrent of that violence. A poem must always be honed down and sharpened. I see a poem like a diamond. You need to polish it. You need to get the facets out and make it shine. It's there, the value, the intrinsic value is there. But it may not always be apparent. And the more you can cut out when you're writing a poem, I think the stronger and the sharper it will be. And this comes from my early days of, I had a lot of contact with Mr. Ezekiel, as I said. He used to read a lot of my work when I was very young. And every time he looked at something, he would say, oh, but there's a comma missing there. And I would get so frustrated. I'd say, but look at the poem, why are you going on about commas and full stops? And he would say, no, Menka, this is the age when you perfect your craft. This is the age when the technique becomes something that you don't even have to think about. Because if you were writing the same way when you were 60, that will be a terrible thing to do. For your age, you're right well. But whatever level you reach, you have to go higher. You have to be able to reach that next step. And for me, that became a very crucial guiding light. It became a very crucial, motto to live by in every aspect of my life, really. And so that's the way I write poetry. I tend to throw away a lot of what I write. I tend to distrust a lot of what I write. I have several poems that I would not want published. In fact, just last year, a very, very senior poet asked me for poems for a book that he wanted to bring out with a very big publisher. And I said, no, I don't have enough poems that I want in a book as yet. So, there are many opportunities like that which I have lost along the way, but it's okay, because I know that when the time is right, the book will happen, and hopefully it'll be the best I've ever done. But I'm willing to wait for that. Why rabbits never sleep. Lettuce is nature's sedative, I read somewhere. So at 3 a.m., I finally decided to make a little salad. There were cockroaches in the refrigerator, but I washed the vegetable well, then peeled layer after layer, startling a sleepy worm that had crawled indignantly from beneath the leaves. But the pieces lay untidily splashed across the plate, like splotches of sun on the street. So I tried another strategy. Common, really. Any housewife poet will know about it. I took a knife, its blade seductive in the dark, and I chopped. The fragments, I noticed as I yawned, had begun to take the most extraordinary shapes. Somewhere, I recognized a bride, her toenail turned to ash. A mother-in-law and husband shut the door. Another piece bore the face of a politician. A third was a child with eyes wide open. And why did the dish resemble a wounded Hiroshima? I went at it like the smiling Nazi in a half-remembered film who invited the prisoner to lunch, then demonstrated the art of cutting carrots. Chop, chop, he said, and as the slices fell, still smiling, hacked the prisoner's finger off. 2, actually, with the words, chop, chop, and another smile. That night, I discovered the reason rabbits never seem to sleep.